Well, Echoes of Wisdom is now out and folks are enjoying it. So today, Pika wanted to talk about the one Zelda game that was released on the Super Nintendo. And that game being The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, another game with Link's name in it. Link to the Past was released for both Super Nintendo in 1991 and 1992, and on the Game Boy Advance in 2002. The Game Boy Advance version is the same game, just with a smaller screen. And today on Code PikaViews, we're actually going to be taking a look at The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. So let's not waste any more time and let's dive right in. The story of A Link to the Past has Ganondorf, the King of Thieves, find this sacred power, aka the Triforce, and use his selfish wish to turn the once golden land into the Dark World. 7 wise sages were tasked to keep the evil at bay and seal away the problem. Unfortunately, the evil managed to seep out and cause havoc all over Hyrule, and Zelda's father was perished in the midst of battle. Aghanim, Ganondorf's right-hand man, was tasked to kidnap and seal the 7 maidens, including Zelda, as the 7 maidens are descendants of the 7 wise men. Zelda telepathically then wakes Link and tells the young boy she's trapped underground in Hyrule Castle's dungeon. As Link awakens, his uncle soon heads out. Not getting very far, Link's uncle either dies or gets exhausted. I mean, to be fair, he kinda did just fall into a pit. I would be exhausted too. Link takes both sword and shield in hand as he goes off to save the princess. Soon finding her in the dungeon, both Link and Zelda escape from the castle's underground. Zelda stays with the priest and Link is tasked to go to Kakariko, where he will find info on where an old man named Sir Hassela lives. Finding that he's at the eastern part of the map, Link meets up with Sir Hassela, who tells Link to prove himself. Once Link conquers the first dungeon, he's given magical boots. Link then proceeds to get the last 2 pendants, which allows him to obtain the Master Sword, the Blade of Evil's Bane. Heading back to the castles, confronting Aghanim, Link is sadly too late as Aghanim ends up sending all the 7 maidens to the Dark World. Link and Aghanim fight, but Aghanim soon retreats and sends the hero to the Dark World. Link now must journey through the Dark World of Hyrule, find the 7 maidens, and defeat Ganon. That's pretty much the whole story of the game. Once you've gotten the 3 pendants, get the Master Sword, and enter the Dark World, Link to the Past becomes this sort of freedom game. Like, I'm not even kidding. You can do any dungeon almost in any order. After completing the first Dark World dungeon, this was a bit unique at the time since, you wouldn't be able to do this in future Zelda titles that came after this one. Unless, you use glitches, of course. We did not end up getting that sense of freedom again until Breath of the Wild. Link to the Past has over 12 dungeons to explore, and that's pretty amazing. When I first played this game, I had no idea you had to go through 8 more dungeons after the 3. To be fair though, the first 3 dungeons were pretty straightforward. Throughout the game, you will be running across Hyrule between dungeons, and then you can end up finding some extra goodies, some heart pieces, some upgrades, and other hidden secrets. There's much to explore in this game, as this is the very first Zelda title on the Super Nintendo. And what an upgrade after going through Zelda 1. Nintendo outdid themselves by taking a system that worked and upgrading it to the point of being comfortable to play. The controls for Link to the Past are great. You no longer have the sword stab, which you basically just stab forward, but instead, you swing your sword in a bit of an arc, making it easy to defeat some enemies. Link's movement also has been improved. You can now move outside the 4 directions you had for Zelda 1. This is a much better way of movement that all top-down Zelda titles would use from now on. Your item usage is the same as Zelda 1, however. You have the sword for one button and the item slot in another. You can only end up using 1 item at a time, which is fine at first. I did end up having a problem with this, but as I played the game, I noticed you would mainly use the many items once or twice to solve puzzles or defeat certain enemies. There are 12 dungeons as I stated before. Compared to the dungeons in Zelda 1 and Zelda 2, the dungeons now have all unique styles. They're a little more recognizable compared to Zelda 1's block textures, which had just different colors and map design. Each dungeon has your keys, a map, and a compass you can obtain. One big key that allows you to get one of the many progression gears in the game. Unlike Zelda 1 though, keys are tied to their dungeons and cannot be taken out of the dungeons. You also don't have like an ultimate key, so you don't have to worry about having a certain number of keys before entering a dungeon. The total dungeons you will be exploring Link to the Past are as followed: Eastern Palace, Desert Palace, Tower of Hera, which are essentially your light dungeons, and then you have your Dark World dungeons, which is the Palace of Darkness, Swamp Palace, Skull Woods, Thieves Town, Ice Palace, Misery Mire, Turtle Rock, and the final dungeon, Ganon's Tower. I do know we also count Castle Dungeon at the start of the game and the Hyrule Castle as dungeons as well, but since in my opinion you don't really get items unless you count the boomerang, you still collect keys to progress. I don't know, overall having this many dungeons is pretty wild, as they don't do this again after this game. Now what's funny is that the first 3 Light World dungeons are not counted as level 1 through 8. The Dark World dungeons, however, do count towards 1 through 8. We know and love in the future top-down Zelda games. Why did I end up mentioning that? I don't know. I just like giving random trivias because it's funny for me. I said that the first 3 dungeons are straightforward. Heck, you can finish the 3 dungeons, get the Master Sword, and get to the Dark World almost within an hour if you know what you're doing. In your first playthrough, you probably would not get to the Dark World in an hour, and honestly, you probably will take just a tiny bit. Link to the Past items ranges from aiding items to magic items, and you have the bow and arrow, which no longer takes rubies like in the first game, but now end up taking ammo instead. You have the good old bombs, which are used for both blowing up cracked walls. They also can do damage to you, because in Zelda 1 they actually didn't do any damage. It's almost like the bombs were just a big puff of smoke. You have the boomerang, which can become the magic boomerang later on. Does the same thing, stun enemies, while also being able to grab faraway items. You have the fire rod, make it a return, but you no longer have it being infinite this time. This time it ends up consuming a new thing that's in the game, magic. Now, even though magic is technically not new because it was in Zelda 2, but the magic has been a little bit more refined here than it was in Zelda 2. Not to say that Zelda 2's magic system wasn't good, it was just that you were kind of limited on what you can do. 90% of the time you're either casting shield or casting life, so that way you don't end up dead. Alongside the fire rod is the ice rod, which can freeze enemies, and if you end up defeating enemies with the new magic hammer, you end up getting magic pots out of them. The new item Hookshot not only becomes a fan favorite among a lot of people, but also a very convenient way to travel in a 2D or 3D titles. The bug catching net that allows you to end up capturing bees, but the biggest thing that you want to capture are fairies, which can be storing your newfound items known as the magic bottles. Bees, the magic ones anyways, can be used on enemies. I never really actually found these magical bees, but these magical bees basically are sparkling, and if you end up using them, they kind of are like a sort of familiar, and they essentially can attack enemies. I don't know if anybody actually uses it to fight Ganon, but hey, tell me otherwise. Like, have you ever used the bee to beat up the final boss? If so, that is hilarious. Anyways, the fairies, however, can be used as extra lives when you die. The thing is though, game still kind of counts if you dying, so be mindful of that. The magic powder, on paper, does absolutely nothing in the game, but it can be used against these new type of enemies known as anti-fairies. And if you end up sprinkling the powder on them, they actually will end up turning into good fairies. Kind of a very good way, just in case if you're taking like a lot of damage in certain dungeons and you kind of need a fairy quick, you end up obviously having these anti-fairies that, sometimes are started to be spread out across most of the dungeons. The Book of Medora is not an item to use on enemies, but it is an item you need to use to be able to read ancient Hylian text. In fact, you kind of need the Book of Medora to actually gain access to the second dungeon in the Desert Palace. Both the Cane of Samaria and the Cane of Burna both have their uses. Samaria has the ability of creating blocks, while Burna can block enemies' attacks and make you essentially invisible. Magic Cape can be used to turn Link invisible. This allows Link to pass through certain obstacles such as spikes. The Magic Mirror, which is given to you by an old man, is needed to cross back over from the Dark World to the Light World. You then have the 3 medallions, each sporting its own MP usage and use in the game. Ether Medallion can be found near the Tower of Hera, and when used, it freezes enemies and also is needed to get into Misery Mire. The Quake Medallion is given to you by a catfish and is found at the Lake of Ill Omen. It's also needed to get into the 8th dungeon, Turtle Rock. And then there's the cost heavy but more useful of the 3 medallions, Bombos. Bombos is not needed to complete the game, but can be used as a screen nuke to get rid of very annoying enemies. And trust me, most of these dungeons, especially the later ones, have very annoying enemies. I'm looking at you, Ice Palace, that seems to love to spam 50,000 enemies on ice platforms. With this many items in hand, you think Link to the Past would be an easy game? It's a little bit yes and a little bit no. Now, the game is not Zelda 1 difficult and is definitely not Zelda 2 difficult, but you will be getting hit a lot in this game. Since both you and the enemies have better movement, there are chances that you'll mainly be getting hit by touch damage. Thankfully, with filling your bottles with both the new red and blue potion, I say new even though red and blue were always in the first Zelda title, red still acts the same way while blue basically is the similar vein, except you cannot drink it twice, you can only drink it once. And it ends up allowing you to restore both your health and your MP at the same time. And also, if you end up having fairies, the chances of death are very slim. But don't fear, when you die in this game, you end up basically getting sent back to the beginning. Now, this can be a little bit difficult for certain dungeons, not all, but there will never be a chance where you'll accidentally die and then you are basically assed out in a dungeon. That will never happen. In later games, however, they will end up putting like portal systems that allows you to essentially warp to the middle of the dungeon, and that's something that I could actually end up bringing up. In Zelda Link's Awakening and Oracle of Ages and Seasons, they have these portals in the game, but in Link to the Past, they don't have those. There are no mini bosses in Link to the Past, unless you end up counting the final dungeon, which ends up basically giving you 3 fights of the same bosses that you fought in the 3 light dungeons. But I don't really count those because they don't even show the portal anyway, so there's that. Some are better than others though, I will end up admitting though. Once you reach the end of the final dungeon of the game and defeat the final boss, what else can you actually do in this Super Nintendo game? Well, if you're playing the Super Nintendo version, absolutely nothing. The game just ends and you basically just reset if you want and just basically do some random challenge run. There is, however, a way to have some longevity with the Super Nintendo version, and I'm kind of going off script here. You can end up playing the randomizer of The Legend of Zelda Link to the Past, or you can end up playing the Legend of Zelda Link to the Past / Super Metroid randomizer, which essentially allows you to play Super Metroid and Link to the Past in a very randomized fashion. And these are kind of cool little ways to make older games have longevity. Randomization is something that I kind of do want to end up talking about in a future video, because I kind of feel that older games have a massive longevity because of randomization, because it gives you a lot of freedom and a lot of capabilities, and it's just overall just a fun thing to do, especially for a game like Link to the Past and also Super Metroid. Especially if you know what you're doing in terms of mechanics wise, you can basically end up playing both of these games in a very freeform manner without having to worry about any restrictions. Hence the reason why I kind of wish that it was very easy to play a randomizer of Breath of the Wild and Link to the Tears of the Kingdom, because it will be really fun to end up playing those things. Now, I end up saying that obviously you can't be able to do anything in the Super Nintendo version, but if you're playing the GBA version, well, you get something a little bit different. Like every Super Nintendo game that ends up getting a re-release on the GBA, you have the screen being a little smaller and you have the sounds taking a bit of a hit. And trust me, it kind of does take a little bit of a hit. But I have to say, I'm a fan of the story being told to you from the start rather than having to wait at the beginning of the title screen. I'm also a fan of both the text and menu being a little bit faster compared to the Super Nintendo version. I love that the dungeon's names is shown to you when you enter it. You can now end up saving wherever you are. There's also an extra warp for the bird that leads you to Turtle Rock area. But that's not the reason you would play the GBA version. Besides, the simple fact you get a nice Super Nintendo port in your hands, but you also get an extra game mode called the Four Swords. For those who are not in the know, The Legend of Zelda Four Swords is a separate game mode that allows you to play with 3 other players. It's a short game mode, only spawning like 4 zones and 3 stages to run through, and it's not really long. It's very small, but the story is mainly has Zelda getting kidnapped by the wind mage Vaati. Link pulls out the 4 swords, splitting himself into 4 links, and the goal is to go through a series of 3 stages, obtaining 3 keys that will allow you to gain access to the final stage and Vaati's palace, which you basically end up having a final encounter with Vaati. Shocker. And the game just ends after that. As I said, this game is short, so it kind of just feels like a glorified demo than anything. And you can tell it's a glorified demo because right after this was released, a few years later, I want to say like, 2004, we end up literally getting a game that's based around the 4 Swords mechanic, which is called The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventure. Now, whether or not Nintendo decides to remake this game is not there at all. I don't know. I don't think they're ever going to go back into the Four Swords formula. But hey, if you guys want to make me wrong, then go right ahead, Nintendo. The cards is in your hands. You have the choice if you want to make this game and make some money, because Zelda fans, they eat all Zelda content. Look at them eating Echoes of Wisdom. I haven't even mentioned that game was even out right now. Actually, that game is already out as I'm actually recording this, but whatever. Now, I will say that it is a fun little mode to be able to play with 3 other players, solving puzzles, working together to fight bosses with 4-player mechanics. Now, that's something I actually do like about Four Swords, is that the bosses are very unique in a sense, where they kind of utilize a lot of the color mechanic. Essentially, sometimes there are bosses, like for instance, the one boss that you end up fighting, you have to tell your friends what color you see on the screen in your game, so that way they know that, oh, this is where my color is at. And I do like that because it's actually pretty cool. Like, the Four Swords mechanic is really good. It's just a shame that we're never going to actually be able to play a actual full game like this, and this is the closest we're gonna get, which is a bit unfortunate, but it is what it is. Anyways, after you end up dragging 1 or 3 of your very lovable friends to suffer in the Four Swords game, you will gain access to the post-game dungeon in Link to the Past, the Four Swords dungeon. Now, at first, I thought this dungeon was lame, but I got some things to say about it finally. This dungeon sports 4 new bosses, which are just reskins of old bosses you fought, but harder. Now, at first, I was going to end up just writing this off, saying that it's the same crap with nothing to really add to it, but oddly enough, after playing through it, yeah, you got to actually play through it to kind of end up understanding. You see how that works? It's so fun. They are the same bosses, but they have new gimmicks. The 4 bosses you fight are Blind, Halmasaur, Argus, and Mothula. Blind has you knock his heads back at him. Halmasaur is a little bit faster and can end up summoning 2 enemy spawns. He also gets a new weak point, which you have to shoot him with the arrows. Argus has jellyfishes rather than puffballs, and Mothula will summon 2 clones of himself. It's easy to know which one is the real one, if the real one is usually the one sporadically jumping around. So, it's fairly easy. The dungeon does end up spawning some very interesting puzzles. They're easy, but there was like one that tripped me up that I couldn't really figure out until I realized that, oh, my arrows can break skulls. Kind of really showcasing that you kind of needed the silver arrows to even get into this dungeon anyways. You also have to beat the game. You don't gain access to this dungeon until you have beaten both Ganon and the Four Swords content. So just be warned by that. But once you end up defeating all 4 of those bosses and obtain the 4 swords, you will then proceed to fight the 4 Shadow Links, each sporting their own moves. But as you defeat one, they will end up adding their moves to another shadow. Green Link starts with a dash. Red will basically dash and spin, but also end up clipping through the wall for some reason, because it's me. If you guys are not familiar, my name is Code Glitch a lot, where for some reason, anytime I play in a video game now, something stupid happens. Anyways, blue will retain the 2 moves and have a down stab, and purple will of course have all the moves but adding a beam attack. Once you end up defeating all 4 of them, congratulations, you've beaten the GBA version of A Link to the Past. You end up getting the credits, and this time around, you kind of end up getting the what happens after the Dark World, rather than what happens after the Light World or whatever. And I kind of find it funny, but at most it just kind of makes me think that the Dark World was not, you didn't beat Ganon and the Dark World monsters just basically take over the area. But I guess it kind of goes back to the Light World. I don't know why they put this Four Swords dungeon in this game, in all honesty. It doesn't really do anything or add anything. The only thing it does, it allows you to see your stats and how many times you use items in the game. That's it. And I don't know, I guess it's just an extra thing. Would I end up saying that that's probably the reason why the GBA version is the definitive version? I don't even know. To be honest, your mileage may vary. If you want to play the Four Swords content, go nuts. If you want to play the Four Swords dungeon, go nuts. If you're not missing much if you don't do them, if I'm being real. Like, it doesn't add anything. Oh, you get to fight 4 links. Great. You get to fight 4 links where the fight is the exact same as you've been doing since day 1. There is nothing different. Kind of really saying a lot how you can't really end up making anything interesting in the top-down Zelda games. Even though Echoes of Wisdom exists, and I'm pretty sure they've made a lot of mechanics interesting. Overall, Link to the Past really holds up as not only being the second top-down Zelda title, but being the Zelda game that most future top-down Zelda titles would end up following. I may not have grown up with the title when it first came out on the Super Nintendo, but I can for sure end up understanding why folks love this game. It's one of the big bangers on the Super Nintendo that most folks would end up having if it's not Super Mario World, Yoshi's Island, Super Metroid. And that's pretty much the end of this episode. This kind of felt like a little bit of a shorter episode, I will end up admitting, but hey, the next game that we'll obviously be talking about will be a little bit longer in structure, and that will obviously be Ocarina of Time. But that's going to be a while. I've been Pika, and I'll be seeing you guys in the next video. You guys won't really know what it is until you end up seeing it, because I am random, depending on how I upload. I'm not consistent. Maybe I will change that. I kind of need to change that. Anyways, I'm ranting. I'll see you guys next time. See yas!